Welcome back, everybody, to the infirmary, where we try to help endurance athletes stop making mistakes in their training and get back to a place where they are moving effectively towards their goal. And I'm super excited to have one of my longtime coach crushes, Kolie Moore from Empirical Cycling and the Empirical Cycling Podcast. Kolie started coaching cyclists and endurance athletes in the early teens, 20 teens, something like that.
Empirical Cycling officially started in January of 2015.
Nice. I got the date right. There we go. 2015. After he noticed that the cycling coaching landscape didn't quite seem to focus on biological processes as much as it could. A graduate of Boston University, go Terriers, where he studied biology, biochem, metabolism, and physiology. He combines that academic background with his own cycling career, where he has been a national championship medalist. Kolie started his podcast, the Empirical Cycling Podcast, in March of 2019 and continues publishing today, helping athletes of all levels train better through understanding the scientific underpinnings of what they are trying to accomplish. He works with professionals, semi-professionals, elite amateurs, and anyone who not only cares about getting better, but is curious about how human bodies adapt to endurance training.
I got to have you do the intro to my podcast. This is great. This is so great.
Although at times, while listening to his podcast, his accent places him as a fellow native of New England, Kolie has fled to Asheville, North Carolina, where the winters are far improved. Kolie, welcome to the infirmary. Let's see if we can help some athletes get better.
Thanks, man. Great to be here.
One of my questions is you got after this in the introduction, but I think you have a really interesting path to coaching at the level that you coach at. Can you talk a little bit about the gap in coaching practices that you saw when you were starting to think about coaching?
Sure. Yeah. I experienced the gap a little bit, but I actually got into coaching because I was talking to some of my friends and I seemed to have answers to their kind of basic training questions. And so they started asking me for plans, and I just was like, all right, why don't you do this? I had a Google Docs spreadsheet, kind of the same way that my coach at the time had for me. And one of my other friends said, if they're getting a training plan, I need a training plan. And by the way, I'm going to give you money for this. And so I did that for a couple months. And then I decided that I wanted to actually start properly coaching because it seemed like fun. I enjoy helping other people reach their goals. And I really enjoy the process of learning. And having graduated from BU and having with a bio degree, but I focused in biochemistry and systems phys, like learning all that stuff was great. But figuring out how it worked on an individual level was really fascinating to me. And that was a chance to do that by helping people realize their goals and kind of trying to understand the process of what's really happening under the hood when we are training. And so with all of that, I eventually got WKO4 and I was trying to get into some media at the time, and I published a blog article, and Tim Cusick reposted it, and he said, I don't know who the author of this is, but they're on the ball. And I went, that's me. That's so cool. And so I eventually joined the WKO4, and Tim decided that I stood out among everybody there. You know, at this point, I think there's 5 or 10, 15,000 users in that group or something like that. And he eventually asked me to do some webinars. And at that point, I also got some feedback from people like Dean Gollish and them, and everybody said oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. And that was the first time that I had gotten positive feedback from people who knew what they were talking about, that I had some kind of perspective that was knowledgeable and unique. And that's when I decided to kind of lean more into that kind of stuff. But at the time, to go back to your original question, the coaching that I was getting that was really not meshing well with my personal physiology was that I'm a very, very sprinty boy. I got a lot of watts up top, and I got kind of mediocre to bad watts down the bottom, which is why my one national championship medal is in the kilo in individual sprint. So on the track. So, and at my best, I was like a 4 watts per kilo kind of rider. And that was with amazing training. And I was fairly light compared to what I am now. And I was getting workouts that were like, okay, VO2 max workouts. And like, I'm like breathing through my nose and I'm like, there's nothing max about this, like 120% at 5 minutes, dude. Like, can I train harder? And they're like, you're the only person I coach who wants to train harder. And I'm like, I don't feel like I'm fucking training. Sorry, am I allowed to curse?
Oh yeah, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, showing that I am from New England. And so that was the coaching landscape at the time, which was, at least the coaches that I knew of, everybody had kind of their own basic philosophy of coaching, and some of them were great, some of them were mediocre, but all of it didn't really understand the underpinnings of training the way that I did a little bit at the time, and the way that, and nobody really had it the way I really thought it could be done. And so that was what pushed me down the avenue that I eventually went, of getting really, really deep into the weeds of the literature on, adaptation and muscle physiology and all that sorts of stuff that's been on the podcast for years.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense because, like, I mean, it is something that it doesn't, a lot of people talk about physiology, but you can tell that it's sort of a like kind of window dressing physiology. And when I first started encountering your podcast, I think I started tuning in right around the VO2 Max series, which I know you have revisited, and you've even said like, I'm gonna re-record all 6, which I was like, oh man, geez, okay.
Did I say that? Oh crap!
You did. You were like, I gotta re-record those, and I was like, does he know there's 6 of them? And I was just like,
8.
okay,
Yeah.
there's somebody here who is like really getting into the weeds of this stuff that I think one of the reasons why athletes misunderstand this stuff is because nobody is actually like explaining what's going on. And, something that happens in triathlon, we were talking about this before, is that like there's so much misinformation because like the market needs to shorten everything up so that it's accessible to basically to be sold. And this is another thing that you always point out on your show is you're like, like somebody who's trying to sell something, there's a bias there that you need to be careful of. And
I mean, we're trying to sell something too, to be
sure,
fair.
yes, but you're not trying to sell something that's like, hey, like, don't look over here, while you do this thing that probably isn't going to actually keep you getting better for a long period of time.
Yeah, true enough. I mean, and that especially happens with like supplements.
Totally. Yeah.
It's like there's one study that shows that there is an effect because p-value was less than whatever the fuck, and so like therefore you have to take this because the gains are going to be great. But like that's also the downside of the supplement industry in the U.S. is that it's very, very poorly, if at all, regulated.
It's not regulated. Yeah, instead.
You can just put in as many weasel words as you want in your claims, and you can pretty much sell whatever and promise the moon. And whether you actually ever acquire the moon, that's another story entirely.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this kind of, so this kind of gets into my next question. Like, you have been very focused on the physiology of training and coaching and everything like that. And then in the last, I would say you've done this more and more over the past like few years and seasons, that you've included more and more RPE stuff in the podcast, at least. And that's not to say you didn't before. I think one of the best things that I've heard from you about VO2 Max is like, just go as hard as you can for 3 or 4 minutes, like whatever the time is for the particular interval, just rail it for that and you're going to get there. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you, like for somebody who has like such a physiological background and talks about physiology a lot, can you talk a little bit about why RPE and perceived exertion is so important for athletes? And even if you're using these like ostensibly objective metrics, like power, heart rate, speed.
Yeah. So I am not the first person to have this perspective, which I think is fantastic. But I also think that it's a case of convergent evolution, because I thought I came up with all this stuff on my own, and a lot of other coaches have too, because when we are training, like my very, very, very first meme that I ever made was the expanding brain meme. And it was training to RPE is how you start. Then it's training to heart rate. Then it's training to power. And then the final one is you're training to RPE again.
Yes.
It's so simple. It's so perfect. I will never top that meme. I'm well aware of that. I've tried many times. And we start there. But then not everybody, a lot of people I think get lost in the more technical aspects. And I think part of this is because the way that a lot of online training platforms structure training, like a bunch of apps. And also, like, if you go into Training Peaks and you get a pre-made plan, or you go onto something on Zwift, everything is relative to VO2 max. And if you go to the Coggin zones, I mean, it looks like it should work just like that. Coggin zones have been updated with WKO4 and 5. So they're very much expanded since then, and they're personalized now, which is great. And some like Training Peaks plans will account for that. But the thing that a lot of people miss with RPE by digging too far into like the power type metrics is that we are not machines.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are very well, okay, I guess we could be considered machines in some very horrible, squishy, fuzzy way. But we are not processing bits like a GPU. We are processing very general signals of oxidative stress, of energetic stress, of total body stress, like, and, mechanical tension, things like that when you get to the gym. And so, or if you're out in the heat, humidity, core temp, like, our brains actually integrate all of these signals. And if we start to ignore that, we can go a very, very, very long way on our training journey without realizing that we're actually backsliding. Because if you quote unquote trust the process, you can be feeling worse and worse and worse, and your performance is going to be like relatively stagnant when it should be getting better and better. And if you take a knee some days, you go, man, my RPE is off, like for my FTP intervals, I got to take today off. And that can be a game changer for a lot of people when you finally start to realize that your brain integrating all of these signals of like life stress, of environmental stress, of training stress. Your brain is called a master gland for a reason.
Yeah, this is a favorite part of of not the last podcast, but a few episodes ago.
Yeah, Kyle thought it was the funniest.
It's a pretty funny term.
Yeah. And I of course leaned into it because I was like, it sounds dirtier than it is, which made Kyle laugh even harder.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but like it's real. It's true. And if you ignore that aspect of everything, you can go a very, very long way into your training journey and get nowhere or even backslide because you think you're doing the right thing because you are rigidly focused on, this is my plan. This is a very horrible analogy. Well, you're a poetry guy, John Keats.
Yeah.
His name was written in water, right? I think there's a line between there and something being written in stone, which is, I think training plans are written in sand. Like they're malleable. They'll last long enough, but if a strong wind comes, like you got to erase what you got there.
Yeah, I always tell athletes, like, there is no perfect training plan, and I certainly don't write perfect training plans because what you end up with is a collaboration between not just the coach and the athlete, but like also everything that's happening in the athlete's life. Like that is eventually you end up with, it's sort of the same way that you talk about that training zones are descriptive, not prescriptive. Like,
yeah, that's an Andy Coggin term. Yeah.
Right. That like training plans eventually are simply descriptive of what you did. Like they shouldn't be a like, this is definitely going to take us where we go because, the journey is never that clear.
Yeah. And I think that I've certainly worked with quite a few people now who will do the plan to a T and they'll say, how come I'm not getting faster? And I'm like, well, how's your life stress? And they'll go, oh, you would not believe what I'm dealing with right now. I'm like, well, why are you training this hard? How come you haven't told me about this stress? They're like, oh, I thought you just do this plan and everything gets better. It's whatever. It's fine. And then we have to have a heart-to-heart about why that's not fine. When somebody starts skipping training sessions, then we really start to see some progress. It's a hard thing when you're working with somebody for 6 months, a year or longer, and they're going, how come I'm not really seeing the progress that you thought I would see? And we have to dig down into it and then eventually find out that there's this fundamental misunderstanding between us. And oftentimes it's that they think the plan is perfect out of the box. And I'm like, oh, no. This is far from perfect.
Yeah, it's a rough draft, and that, again, that kind of gets into another question. It goes back. I don't know if you were talking about this particular article, but when you publish the article on Training Peaks, you're training too hard for criteriums. This is a two-part question because I also want to talk about your FTP test, the Kolie Moore FTP Test trademark or registered or whatever.
I did not name it after myself.
I know you didn't. A great little discussion about how we name stuff in one of your podcast episodes recently. But can you talk a little bit about why you wrote that article, and then also how you help athletes understand that lower intensity is sometimes better?
Oh, yeah, sure. One of the things about that article is that it came from some of my personal experience with cyclocross training, because I had a couple coaches coming up, and a lot of the training was really short, sharp efforts. And I was really, really good at those. And everybody's like, oh, you're going to be amazing at cyclocross. And I was serviceable, like in the Cat 4s at best.
Right. Yeah.
Like I had a handful of podiums. I never made it to the threes. I didn't want to go to the threes because because I had done a couple 3-4 races and I knew how hard I was getting my ass kicked there. And so I had no interest in doing the threes. And so there was this fundamental, I guess, I don't know how you would call it. Like I was experiencing one thing and everybody said it was another way. Because like some of my friends who were not so sprinty, who had amazing like aerobic thresholds, they would ride away from me in cyclocross races. And I'm like, I'm getting told I have a great sprint. I should be kicking your ass. And I cannot. What's the deal? Oh, my FTP is like 280 watts and yours is 350 watts. And so right there, I'm seeing that what I'm experiencing is very much not how it's happening. And so then I realized, of course, that you not only need to have a good sprint, you also need to have a lot of aerobic power, because recovering from your sprints is almost entirely aerobic. And if you don't do the aerobic training, if you just did sprint training, you are going to be great at like a track race. You're going to be great at like a 10-lap scratch, but you're not going to be great at a 40-minute cyclocross race. And I was not. And so that kind of aerobic foundation is, I think, what a lot of people sometimes are now, but of course at that point a lot of people were really missing. And so that was one of the gists of that article, because I had that experience and I thought it would be useful for people to understand that, and I also leaned into people's general conception of like phosphocreatine for sprinting, that kind of thing. And so I leaned into that understanding and tried to show people like, look, if you want to get really good at repeated sprints, you absolutely need aerobic training. And I had also been coaching a couple collegiate athletes who, of course, did a lot of racing, but beyond the racing, they didn't really do that much hard effort training. Like they didn't do a lot of sprints or 30-30s or anything like that, because the racing took care of that. And so we mostly, and also you can't overload somebody with that much intensity. Not that a lot of triathletes are doing that, but certainly in the road competitive world, that happens a lot. And so it was like a combination of like intensity management and also shoring up the very basic aerobic training that you need for those kind of efforts. Once you do that, I mean, I coached a national champion in the criteriums, and that was the first national championship that one of my athletes had won, and I was so happy. And I think that article came out before that win, but maybe it was after. I forget. Yeah. What was the second part of your question? I forgot.
Well, second one, sort of jumps on to the FTP test, that this is a similar idea, like you had these two articles that kind of came out within like a year of each other on Training Peaks, I feel like. And that was sort of, I think that's where I sort of noticed, I was like, oh, wow, this is a really cool idea. This is important. We need to be listening to this guy. And then the FTP test, I mean, the traditional 20 minutes minus 5%, it's a lot out there in the cycling world. I cannot tell you how deeply ingrained it is in the triathlon world. And which is, again, it's probably one of those things where the nature of triathlon is much more steady state. And so people tend to latch on to stuff like that. And again, like, because it's a logistical problem, triathletes are looking for simple fixes because there's just too much to keep track of. And, so you came up with this new test, which is a much longer test and one that sort of builds as it goes. And can you talk, and I know you could do an entire episode on this, but can you just talk a little bit about why a test that is longer and stays a little bit more in the aerobic domain is probably going to serve athletes better than the 20 minutes all out minus 5%.
Yeah, I think it's probably not as much of a danger in the triathlon world, as people don't really do a lot of efforts over threshold. And so the anaerobic capacities that are contributing to a 20-minute effort are a lot smaller. Like when I was road racing, my anaerobic capacity was about 30 kilojoules or so.
That's up there. It's a big one.
It's up there. It's not the biggest. At my peak shape for track sprinting, I was around the 45, 50 kilojoules. Yeah, about a 2200 watt sprint and a 200-ish watt FTP. Do the math. And that really influences what you can do for 20 minutes. Of course, I think in triathlon, like I said, a lot less anaerobic capacities, but it's not like they're zero. Like I think at the very, very top level, like your best triathletes, it would probably even underestimate FTP by a little bit, which I think is a much better problem to have than having it overestimated. But also like where your FTP is relative to your VO2 max, like mine was always pretty low compared to a lot of other well-trained cyclists. And so that really put me in the like 90% range personally. And so, like, again, my own physiology kind of being at odds with the common wisdom of the time. And so what I started doing was, and also because WKO4 was out, and WKO4 is probably, in terms of like modeling software, was and still is by a long shot the best that's available in the market. And so the downside is that you have to keep the model fed pretty well.
Yeah.
So you understand if you are not doing a lot of testing that the model's not necessarily going to be accurate, or et cetera, et cetera. And so it was clear, though, that WKO4 was looking for an inflection point. And with an inflection point in the 30 to 80-ish minute range, and my athletes who had done like a 40K TT, or they had, they've got a long climb near them, or they just, had done these types of efforts, and whether they had or not, the model was pretty good at finding it. So that, plus realizing that the best predictor of performance is performance itself, and also going back all the way to the RPE meme, when we put those things in a bowl and mix them up, we get, why don't we just ride at FTP by feel? Because I can feel it. I'm sure all of my clients can feel it, and we just have to be aware of it. It's like that thing where if you start thinking about red cars and you see every red car on the road and you're like, wow, they're everywhere. And then something switches it off and you're like, how come there's no more red cars anywhere? Or whatever that thing is, you know what I'm talking about. So it's like, if you make yourself aware that you can feel this and you go, oh yeah, how come my 20-minute test result has me gasping after a 5-minute FTP effort? Because it's overestimated. It's really quite simple. And so the test was basically a series of ramp tests from a little below to a little above threshold, out to, like, the last progression was starting a little below threshold and then just kind of riding up to it. And that's what that 100% target in the article means, is like, that's where you feel your threshold is. I went back and read it again recently, and I was like, that's the only thing I wish I could change, is explaining what that means. But otherwise, that's what it's about. You can feel this and you can just ride at it. And I don't even do many FTP tests with my clients anymore. Like, instead of doing an FTP test to start the season out, I'm like, give me 3 or 4 by 10 at FTP, go.
Yeah.
I don't even give it a number. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and again, like, talking for a triathlon audience, who is time limited and trying to figure all this stuff out, on the quick, like, what are some of those sensations that you're talking about where you're locating FTP? And this is kind of getting into this discussion about RPE, is like, what do you feel in your body? And then, like, what are some of the things that your athletes report feeling when they are at or around FTP?
It's the easy way to think about it is, it's the hardest pace that you can sustain where you feel like you can sustain it for a while. And I usually use a couple cues with my athletes to let them know that they're there and if they're above it. And I usually encourage people to poke that ceiling a little bit just to see what's beyond, because sometimes people can underestimate their FTP because they're either stuck in a rut with a number or any other number of things. And so the way that you want to poke the ceiling is if you are riding at, let's say you're riding at 250 watts, and this feels hard but sustainable. Your breathing is controlled. It's not ragged. Well, it'll be labored, but not ragged. But now if I go to 260 and suddenly the effort feels like it's a lot harder, like that RPE has decoupled, like you've gone from this is a comfortable 7 or an 8, maybe 7.5. And now I feel like I'm going to get to a 9 pretty quick and then a 10. Like that's a sign that you're over. Another thing, if you have a large anaerobic capacity like me, that RPE may not switch because you can go so deep over threshold that it's like for a couple minutes, it's not a big deal. But what does happen is your breathing starts to get ragged. And when that happens, that's usually a sign that you are not only over threshold, but you have been for a couple minutes. And you got to back it down. So finding that place where your RPE is, this is hard, but I can keep it going. Like that's what it's all about. It can sound intimidating to people who've never tried it before, but this is one of my favorite things about coaching people who are newer to training is they don't know that they should be intimidated by it. Mm-hmm. So when I tell people to go do this, 9 times out of 10, they're going to nail it right away even if they've never done it before. If they have any athletic training whatsoever, they can get it. And it's occasionally when somebody overthinks it or is a little optimistic. So if I think somebody's threshold is 250 watts, and I'll be like, all right, give me 5 minutes at 220, 230, then bring it up to 240 for a couple minutes, then maybe sneak up to 250, see where you're at, and kind of, if it's a little too high, bring it down. If it's a little too low, poke the ceiling. And somebody goes from 220, 230, and they go right to 280, and then that's that 1 out of 10. Somebody's a little ambitious there. And I think that's great because I love an optimist. I'm an optimist, often a disappointed optimist. And so it's really that simple. And oftentimes I think at worst, it's taken people like 3 tries to get it. But once you have it for life. Like you should not be having to reestablish what does FTP feel like every year or 2 or anything like that. Like even right now, I am in terrible aerobic shape and I can go out and feel out my FTP in like 5 minutes or less.
Yeah.
It's not impressive, but I can do it.
But you know where it's at. Yeah, exactly. Right. And like, one of the things that I think, athletes do struggle a lot sometimes with like, test anxiety and things like that. Like, how do you work with athletes to get them out of a mindset where they think that, this number is sort of a referendum on who they are as both an athlete and sometimes as a person?
Well, haven't you been on Reddit? It definitely is.
I know. Yes, it definitely is.
Yeah, there are some people who are just garbage at testing. And that's fine. It's not like you have to test. If you can feel out your FTP, great. And the thing is, if it's a couple watts lower than your ego wants it to be, you are going to train so much better having that real number. And oftentimes you're over the course of a couple weeks or a couple months, sometimes a couple of years, your threshold will surpass what your ego had thought it was once you start training properly. Training with an overestimated FTP accumulates a ton of fatigue. Like if you are doing, let's say you've got 3 hard workouts in a week, like one of them is VO2 max and you've got a threshold workout and then you've got a race pace workout for triathlon. That's a hard week. And especially if you are trying to do it over multiple disciplines, but let's just pretend it's all on the bike. You've got your VO2 max workout. That's really hard to start with. Then you've got your threshold workout, which is overestimated. So that's kind of a VO2 max workout also. And now you've got a race pace workout and you may not have recovered from your previous too hard threshold workout. And so that's not going to be great. And now you've started the downward spiral.
Yeah.
And to say nothing about any other types of stress going on in your life, because if job stress, relationship stress, if whatever is higher than normal, what's going to happen is your master gland is going to decide that today's not the day to really have a lot of watts and, you're not going to have some good workouts. So all this stuff can tie together in the end.
Yeah, Totally. The next few questions are kind of about, like slightly bridging the gap over to multisport. Don't worry, I'm not going to like pin you down in any way like that. But like, I know that you have coached some multisport athletes in the past. I know you don't at the moment. And a lot of people who do listen to your show are triathletes. And every now and then, triathletes come up on your show, usually as the triathlete who is like training at race pace all the time. And, triathletes are known for that, basically going out and it's all tempo and it's all sweet spot, like all the time. Can you talk a little bit about why that is a less than productive manner to go about your training?
Sure. I'm going to reference Dean on this one. So way back in the day, Dean and I were working on a project, and Dean was just kind of generally complaining about how triathletes train. He was saying that it's the triathlon black hole or something like that, where they're always training at race pace. And so they're always a little bit tired. Like every ride, every run, every swim is race pace. And like, if you are some sort of genetic freak, that's going to be plenty. Congratulations. We're all jealous. Mazel tov. But for the rest of us normies, what's going to happen is you are never training hard enough to really stress any physiologic system sufficiently to see progress, or you are not recovering well enough to see progress either. And so what you end up seeing is somebody who's bogged down by trying to be too specific. And at the end of the day, specificity is absolutely necessary, but we can always have too much of a good thing. So what we really need to do is think about periodizing. So at some point, I need to stress my VO2 max if I want to raise my threshold. At some point, I need to stress my threshold if I really want to improve my endurance. And then when it comes time, I will do my endurance pace or my race pace workouts, mostly to find what my pace is. Occasionally, if you need work on that type of stuff, like let's say if you're working on like an Ironman pace and you're having trouble with the endurance, okay, yeah, you absolutely need to start building that pace out. Otherwise, it's really a simple game in terms of stressing systems and getting ready to race.
And to kind of continue that point, like every non-drafting triathlon, draft legal triathlon's a little different, but every non-draft triathlon is essentially like a steady state effort on the bike that is then followed by a relatively long event where you are now doing mostly eccentric contractions on the run, which is, one of the reasons why triathlon is like, why it hurts afterwards. If you were thinking about that puzzle where you want to try to like ride as fast as you can without compromising those eccentric contractions on the run, like what kind of training principles would you start with? To kind of, and if you were thinking about the puzzle of multisport, which is essentially that like the swim and the bike are transportation to the beginning of however long your running race is, either a 10K, a half marathon, or a full marathon.
Oh God, if it's transportation, why don't you just take the bus? Jeez.
People have done that.
I know, I've heard, yeah. Subway too, I believe.
Yep. Yes, that's right. A subway. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if we're thinking about it like transportation, why is that illegal? That's the interesting part about triathlon is this is to me where multisport gets divided into people who need to build up their running endurance, like the integrity of their bones and their tendons and their muscles to actually handle that eccentric pounding for that long, versus people who are fine at that and they need to work on other things with their run instead. So to me, that's kind of where it breaks down. And so if I were coaching somebody of the former, where they need to build up that running endurance, I would have them mostly do their hard training on the bike. And I would have the running be mostly volume focused, like let's build you up to being able to handle this. And then when we are well trained enough, then you've got the luxury of doing hard running workouts. Then we can do that. But I'm not going to have you get off the couch and start doing 400-meter repeats on the track because, well, how many injuries can you possibly get? I remember coaching one cyclist who wanted to do like a 5K, like a turkey trot or something. And I had him doing what I thought was a pretty reasonable approach. And I started having him like get more into like some race pace as we were going over the course of like, I don't know, 2 months or so. And he ended up with shin splints. And I was like, okay, well, like, let's talk. How hard are you running? And he was running a lot harder than I thought he was. And that's also one of the issues that you can run into is somebody who's so aerobically fit, but doesn't have the conditioning for the running in order to in order to, what's the right way to put this? It feels so easy because you're so aerobically fit that you don't know that how fast you're actually running. I really didn't coach much multisport after that. And so I never really developed a system to keep somebody from doing that. But I presume that you've got something in place for that.
Yeah. I mean, like, the run is always the thing that hurts people. And then in particular, there's 2 runs in the week that you have to be careful of. It's it's the track session. And especially like you're saying, athletes that have like a Ferrari engine and like a Pinto chassis, that's a problem.
Twist that chassis like a pretzel.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's like you're going to destroy the car simply through revving the engine. And then, the other one is the long run, just because people don't understand that every time your foot hits the ground, you're accelerating 4 times your body mass through your skeletal system. That's a lot. And you do that 180 times a minute if you're running at 90 RPM. And it is so stressful that that if somebody I remember I was coaching somebody who was primarily cyclocross racer, and this was pretty early on, and they were like, well, I need to do some running, and I sent them out for a half-hour run. Yeah. And a multi-sport athlete, that's a trivial event. To somebody who has just been doing concentric contractions for most of their sport, that he was sore for a week. Just absolutely, the tendons, the ligaments, muscles were all kind of effed. And so, yeah, getting that person up to speed, so that they can actually handle it and, and move in that direction. How would you approach the cycling piece of it? I'm gonna ask you that part.
Piece of what? Cyclocross training?
No, for triathlon. If again, you're trying to build that ability to run effectively afterwards, what would you do? What would your approach be on the bike side of things?
Yeah, so I'm actually fortunate that I have consulted with a couple triathletes over the last couple of years. I do a lot of consultations every year. Occasionally, somebody wants my opinion on triathlon, and I give them all the disclaimers, I'm not a multi-sport coach, but I could tell you very general things, but I cannot I don't know what a typical running session looks like for triathlon. So I usually tell them to think about it like reverse periodization, but not exactly reverse, because reverse usually implies the hardest stuff first, and that is not the way you really want to approach training when you get off the couch. I mean, you certainly can. If you like that and it works for you, great. But I usually think about it like you need a ramp in to your reverse periodization. So I usually think about it in terms of spending a couple months building up to doing the hard training at some point, kind of interspersed throughout, if you want to increase your VO2 max and your kind of max ultimate pace that you can sustain, that's necessary work to do. And then, you start folding in more type of race pace stuff as you go. And one of the things that I actually love about periodization is that exactly what comes when is less important than making sure that you're set up to do it well and without getting injured, and that it all eventually gets done. And so within those parameters, as long as you get some VO2 max work in, as long as you get some long threshold work in, as long as you get some race pace stuff in, and you kind of go from general training to specific training, the specific details are kind of irrelevant, which is, number one, freeing, and number two, incredibly intimidating for a lot of people. And so once you start thinking in those terms, though, your goalposts of the season tend to create your periodization structure for you and how hard you train. If you're going to do a whole VO2 max block, which I usually don't recommend for triathletes, but if you were going to do that, it's pretty obvious where it should go in your season based on what your goals are, when you take your season break, and when you have the most life stress. Mm-hmm. So within those factors, it becomes pretty obvious. So in a lot of ways, it's intimidating and freeing, but also it allows it to fit into your life the best.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying, is that it can be this more sort of modular system, and this is kind of what we're talking about in terms of RPE and the pieces, the correct pieces coming when it's not that there's a particular order, but you train these different systems, and that the eventual goal is to assemble them into something that works differently than when you began. And it's sort of it sounds like what you're saying is well, we need to find those places where we can stress the different energy systems, but it doesn't have to come in this perfect, first you do X, then you do this, then you do this, then you do that. I think the puzzle of triathlon is like that you're trying to assemble that across 3 different disciplines across like a season, and like that's where the real like difficulty of like coaching for multisport comes from.
Yeah, and that's where your own personal weaknesses would really dictate a lot of the plan too. Because if somebody really needs to work on their swimming, like when I consult with triathletes, I tell them, I don't know shit about swimming, and you seem to not care about swimming, so you should just swim to make it to the end without drowning.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can think about your actual pace and training and stuff. And so once you get to somebody who like really needs to work on their swimming and really needs to do some intervals and stuff like that, like, oh, that is way out of my area of expertise. But that's where having a really good triathlon coach like you would be a great way to, help figure out those puzzle pieces. Because like if your bike is your strong leg and you need help on the swimming and the running, like it becomes obvious, well, to a good coach, like when you should work on those things and kind of and how to kind of put the things you're good at into maintenance and stress the other things. So, and that's well beyond my area of expertise in triathlon.
You just brought up the consultations that you've done, and you've gotten to work with, like through the consultations and then through also your own personal athletes and everything like that. You've worked with people at like this huge spectrum, from beginners all the way up to world tour professionals and stuff like that. What can the rest of us learn from kind of like the training methods and mindsets that you see of those athletes that are, racing the world tour, racing Conti Cups, stuff like that? Like what have you noticed that, if anything, unifies them? What have you noticed that unifies them?
The thing that stands out among them is they get paid to ride their bike.
That's the one distinction you're willing to
That is
make.
the one distinction. However, I can also tell you, having worked with a bunch of those folks, the ones who are making progress every year versus those who are kind of stuck, and this goes for amateurs too, and this is what we can actually learn, is that the balance of stress and the focus is our top priorities. So for an average athlete who is struggling to be consistent on the bike or consistent with whatever they're training in, I mean, consistency underlies everything. Of course, consistency can be overdone. I've certainly consulted with people who are training too much, too hard, too often, like there's no recovery days, it's all zone 2, and et cetera, et cetera. So we have to find a balance. And that's the thing about people who are the best, is their focus and their ability to read their legs and take care of themselves and adjust their training on the fly. Like this is where they really stand out to me. And so whenever I work with folks like that, stuff like workout execution is not even something we hardly ever talk about, unless it's like a totally new thing. But at some point, the discussion really becomes more about what direction are we going in? Like what aspects of your physiology are we focusing on? Like, are we trying to gain muscle? Are we trying to lose weight? Like, what kind of rider are you? What races are you going to? What races does your team want to take you to? What does your team expect of you? And once we have all these things in place, then everything will emerge from that. But until then, it's those folks who are really, really, really good, besides being blessed with really good genetics, which is good for them, whatever. Not jealous at all. Besides that, like their work ethic is really, really high. And I think at some point, even if you get like 10 people who have like amazing world-class genetics, that's where the work ethic can make a big difference, and the focus and this is also where I think a lot of people can benefit from learning from these folks, is investing in yourself in the right way can make a big difference. And so if you are going to invest in like a new bed, or like you're going to really dial down your sleep routine, or you're going to hire a nutritionist, these things can make a massive, massive difference. Of course, they may make a small difference, but when you pile up all the small differences, you can end up having a kind of a night and day change in your seasons.
Okay, I've got, my usual like final like couple joke questions, but before we get to those, I want to kind of circle back around to RPE. It is something that I struggle with in terms of the athletes that I work with. And again, I don't, cyclists can be very data focused, and triathletes certainly are very data and metric focused. I want you to imagine that I am an RPE skeptic.
Fair enough.
Make your case to like why I should be making RPE kind of like a metric that is slightly above the other objective metrics, like again, power, heart rate, pace, speed, all that stuff. Like, walk me through why this is going to help me become a better athlete.
Well, besides the fact that a clone of you who is paying attention to RPE is going to get a lot better, a lot faster, and they're going to kick your ass at the next race. That's the number one reason that you should think about it. But I think that there's a couple things at play with people who are really skeptical about RPE. Number one is they think that they cannot really feel it. And they think that they need to be thinking more about their power or their, whatever other metrics we are going to have soon, like their blood oxygenation or their breathing rate or ventilation rate or anything like that. And so I think in a lot of ways, when people over focus on their hard metrics rather than the subjective metrics, I think there's a couple motivators that drive that. I think the first one is that they want excuses to work hard. And when you start incorporating RPE, you're going to feel like a lazy fuck half the time, because I could go out and I could ride, but I feel horrible today. Like, I'm getting a little sniffle. I had a hard day at work. Like, I missed lunch for whatever reason. Today's not the day to go do that, most likely. So I'm going to kick this to tomorrow. And maybe today I'm just going to rest. You're going to feel like such a bum. It's genuinely harder to skip a training session than it is to hammer a training session when you feel horrible for most people. And so I think that that's part of it. Our fitness is not an Excel document. Like, you don't just get to save state and just pick it up later in the same exact spot. It's like an Excel document that's like deteriorating slowly.
The database has like not been maintained in decades.
Right. And so that leads people a lot of the time to just decide to train way too hard, especially if you put too much stock in the objective metrics, like your TSS or, take your pick. A lot of the time you can really miss the fact that you need a lot more rest than you do. And this is one of the things I've been fascinated by is when I'm working with people who come back for a consult later after we stop coaching relationship, and I see what they've been doing since. And it's a lot. It's either like 10 times harder than I would ever give them for training, and they're in a tough spot, which is why they're coming back, or it's a lot easier and they're doing really well. And the former is that's an underhand over home plate. The latter is that a lot of the time when somebody's working with a coach, they want to get every workout in, or they want to get the most of their money, and they think that the workouts are what they're paying for. But what you're really paying for is the coach's knowledge and expertise in adjusting those things. It's in working with people, not generating training plans. And so your subjective metrics, like how you feel, matters so much to that, to the point where we don't have any kind of athlete contracts or anything like that, but I've thought about it in order to explain to people that, like, we need your subjective feedback to do our jobs properly.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't have that, we cannot make you nearly as fast as we could possibly make you. And in fact, you may actually get worse if you're not telling us what's going on with you. And most of the time for that, it's net neutral. Getting worse is kind of rare, but it can happen. So just the balance of stress, just Google allostasis.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see what I mean. Google hormesis and you'll see what I mean. So managing the dose in addition to all the other stressors in your life matters a lot. And that's why when you get paid to ride your bike and train and run and swim, like it's so easy because you have very few other stressors.
Mm-hmm.
I have actually worked with people who are so stressed about getting in the training so perfectly that stress itself starts to spiral them out of control, and is to the point where I tell them, like, I think coaching is actually doing harm to you because you're trying to do this so perfectly. And unless you can give yourself some grace on this stuff, you're working against your own best interests, and not on purpose. And this is a lot of time where a good sports psychologist can become really handy. And this is a rare instance, but like it has certainly happened to a couple of my clients over the years. So yeah, RPE is a necessary thing to track. I would put it, I think once you have a good method of incorporating RPE, heart rate and power and pace,
mm-hmm.
Sorry, I guess we have to include pace.
Yeah,
On cycling, we usually don't.
It's the worst. It's the worst. I fight
All
this
right,
fight
so
all the time.
all right, go get your stride working. So between heart rate, power, and RPE, that's to me like the holy trinity of metrics. Like you don't get any better than that. And so whenever I like consult with somebody, I'm looking at their metrics over time, I'm trying to figure out what's going right, what's going wrong, what needs improvement. If somebody's tracking their RPE and how they're feeling, that makes my job 1,000 times easier, because if they're improving and they're feeling horrible, I'm like, great, you probably just need a couple more rest days, or maybe you need some sleep, or maybe you need some better nutrition, but things are going well and we can improve this drastically. If somebody's feeling good and things are kind of flatline, I'm like, okay, are you really feeling good? First of all, and if you are, then maybe you actually need to train harder. That's entirely possible too. So yeah. So once you kind of triangulate future directions with those kind of basic metrics, everything becomes obvious, at least to me.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're engaged in is sort of using RPE to try to fix the athlete's thermostat. Like if it's broken, you'd be able to figure out like, okay, is this athlete kind of engaging with intensity in a way that seems right? And if not, then we can test it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, I think, like I said, most people want to outwork other people. But training is not med school. Like you do not get rewarded by staying up a couple extra hours to, really, really nail the bones in the hand. Like that's great, but you don't have to. And in fact, it'll do you dirty in the long run.
Yeah, it's going to work against you. Yeah. I mean, that athlete that you're describing, that is like doing the training plan perfectly and then like their life is falling apart. Like, I'm like, oh, this is an addict. I'm not dealing with an athlete. This is somebody whose life has become unmanageable. And at that point, like that's way beyond our scope of care. And so you're like, yes, we need to, then you need to involve a sports psychologist or, a psychologist to try to get them.
AA, Athletes Anonymous.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. I'd never put that together that could be. But okay, one of my favorite pages of your website is the library. I always find something in that page on your website that I'm like, that's really curious.
They're right here on my bookshelf.
Ken Binmore's book, Game Theory. Talk to me about how this has showed up in your coaching.
Oh, that's a good question because I haven't read it in so long. I actually forget what it's about.
Okay.
I don't know. Ask me another one.
That one jumped out at me this time. I was like, all right, I'm going to put that on the list and see what that is on.
I mean, so I'm looking at here's a couple of my favorites. I got to put this one on. I just read Immune by the guy who does that in a nutshell. What's the German Stacked in a nutshell. I also have
oh my God,
this is Energy
that's
Transformations
awesome.
in Living Matter, Hans Krebs and Hans Kornberg. Hans Kornberg was actually my biochem teacher. But I also have stuff from Nick Lane. I have 3 Nick Lanes up here. I've got Herman Poncer. I've got Burton Trivers, Genius and Conflict. I love that book. And I've got a bunch of regular ass training books. Like I've got Astran and Shepard. I've got the Kolie novel, that giant strength and power and sports thing. And this is all just stuff that I've just read over time that whether or not directly it helps in my coaching, I couldn't say, but I think that's the thing that drives me and my interest is stuff that's I'm just curious. I just want to know about this stuff. Like I read so many books that have nothing to do with training. And I read most of the training books that are out there anyway, but they don't really inform what I'm doing. And I couldn't tell you, of course, that like Nick Lane's book, what's my favorite of these? Power, Sex, Suicide.
That was the other one that jumped
out
at me that I was like,
I mean, that one's about mitochondria.
Cool.
Is it?
Oh, amazing.
I think it's about mitochondria. I forget. Transformer is definitely about mitochondria. So yeah, and all this stuff is fascinating because it's a perspective on the things that we think about for training and performance that it's a totally different angle to take on all this stuff. And so when you spend your time reading that kind of stuff, I think it gives you an appreciation for what other people think about the things that we think only do one thing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great phrase. I like that. Do you know Tim Krabbe's The Rider? Have you read that book?
Love that book. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I was like, why is that not on this list?
I think about that book, no joke, on a monthly basis with the water bottle. Because
yes, yeah,
if
those
you've
pictures
had
are
one
false.
semester of physics, you understand that you're still carrying that bottle up the mountain.
Yeah.
However, I think it actually beautifully illustrates the cyclist mindset of, I'm not sure if it works or not, but I'm going to do it anyway because everybody else seems to do it. I love that aspect.
Yeah, the mythology of it too, like that's such an important piece of cycling and cycling history, is the like, okay, those photos of Anquetil are wrong, even though we can see the bottle in the bottle cage, like even though that's there. And yeah, that I think about that book almost every day. It's a remarkable. It's, I think, the one of the only good endurance sport novels that has ever been written.
I would throw Dog in a Hat up there too.
It's a good one. Yeah, that is also a good one. What are you excited about at Empirical Cycling in the next 12 months?
God, I don't even think that far ahead. At Empirical Cycling, we have a couple things on the burner right now, which typically happens in the off season. A lot of conversations, a lot of people want to do stuff. So we're looking at starting to coach an up and coming team at the kind of like the domestic elite level with one of our coaches. I personally am the performance manager, director. I forget what title I've been given. United Cycling Women's Team. And that's awesome because I'm working with somebody to make a system to track health and performance so we can make sure that everybody gets the help that they need if they're having a tough time, and we're supporting them as best we can. What else are we doing? I have like 85 tabs open right now because I have a ton of research that I'm doing on a couple different podcasts that I'm looking at. And I actually just got to close about 30 because we released the creatine episode finally.
Yes. Yeah.
That was absolutely consuming my life. And not only that, but I also had to shore up my understanding of meta-analyses to make sure, like, what is an I-squared statistic really, and that kind of stuff. Because it didn't come up on the podcast, but just to make sure my understanding is there. So all that stuff is happening, and there's going to be a lot more, but I think I'm most excited for my personal clients for next year, because I'm coaching a really wonderful group of people, and whether or not they're just training to have a good trip in the mountains over the summer, or if they're trying to get a world tour contract, stuff like that. Like I'm really, really, really excited for all of it.
That's awesome. I mean, like any good coach, eventually you were like, I'm mostly excited about my athletes.
Yeah. And I think that, and there's pressure that comes with it too, but it's a good pressure. I'm sure you've been in the same place with your clients where you're excited for them and you want to do right by them, but at the same time, you got to make sure that you got all your ducks in a row, and that they're holding up their end and you're holding up your end, and that's where the magic happens.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, our job is essentially, we are responsible for people's athletic dreams, which is like a fairly significant responsibility to carry. And it's not 100% our responsibility, but like the coach is the person who kind of sets the course. And that's intense.
We are in charge of a lot of time in somebody's week.
Yeah.
A lot of their waking hours. I remember the first time I was really viscerally aware of this, I was coaching somebody on MIT, and she was doing awesome. And she loved training. She loved racing. She was great at all of it. And her boyfriend came up to me on campus one day, and he goes, "Oh, you're Kolie. Oh, you control my life." And I went, "Oh, dude, I'm so sorry. But hey, this is what she wants to do. You talk to her about it." And then when the instruction comes through her to me, like, we'll change things up. But for now, this is what she wants. And he was like, "I know." But now she's retired. They've got kids, and they're having a great time.
It's all good. Yeah. Yeah. I used to work in schools, and, sure, the head of school kind of does things. Really, the person who runs the school is the person who's in charge of the schedule, and like, so it's the administrative assistant who runs the office that is actually in charge of how everything is actually going. Well, where can people find you in all the places? Where can people interact with you and Empirical Cycling and hear about all the things that you're up to?
Just Google Empirical Cycling. Check out the podcast first. We're working on actually turning a couple of our podcasts into articles at the moment. So if people who don't want to listen, they can read instead. We are also up on Instagram at Empirical Cycling. I do a weekend AMA up there. So if you want to go ask me questions, I will, unlike the 1.5 to 2+ hour podcasts where we dig in really, really deep, I will give you an old Twitter length answer. So if you want short content, that's where to find that. And of course, just check out our website. And if you have any questions, just email me empiricalcycling@gmail.com, and be happy to hear from any and all of you lot.
And I can say with personal experience, Kolie is amazing at answering emails. So yeah, if you send him an email, he's
That's
very likely
bullshit.
to get back to you.
It takes
No,
me
it is
months to get
true.
back to you.
No, it's ridiculous. Every time I've been like, there's no reason he should respond to this, and I get a response. So, I appreciate that, and so will other people. But thank you so much, man. It's always awesome to talk to you. It's always fun to have you on the show. I always learn something. My listeners are always going to learn something. And thanks for everything that you're doing in terms of keeping people fast and healthy.
Doing my best, dude. Thanks for having me again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so much. Thanks so much. We'll see you around.